If someone had told me $20 could feel heavier than a secret, I would have called it dramatic. Sabrina tugged the collar of her thrift store blazer for the 5th time, willing it to look pricier than it was. Her heart thudded as she stood outside the elegant Italian restaurant downtown, staring up at the golden sign, La Lussuria. The irony wasn't lost on her, lust, of all things. What was she doing here? She had only $20 in her wallet. She hadn't been on a proper date in years, let alone a blind one, and certainly never at a place where the menu didn't dare print prices. She knew it was a terrible idea, but desperation had its own rhythm, and hers had been pounding lately. Her roommate, Nina, had insisted, "You need to put yourself out there, SAB. Just one date, one night. Maybe she's the one." Sabrina had laughed. With my luck, she'll be a catfisher with a felony record and a gluten allergy. But now she was here, dressed in her best Goodwill combo, clutching a $20 bill like it was a golden ticket. If she ordered a glass of water and pretended to be full, maybe she could survive this. Or maybe her date would be cool, down to earth. Someone who didn't care that her shoes had been duct taped 3 times or that her last meal was 2 packets of instant ramen. She stepped inside. The warmth and elegance of the place wrapped around her like silk, and instantly she felt out of place. The maitre barely glanced at her before asking for the reservation name. Sabrina," she said, her voice trembling. "Table for 2. It might be under Tess. Teresa, maybe." The man checked the list, then gave a tight smile. "Right this way." Sabrina followed him, ignoring the judgmental eyes of the high-class diners, their designer suits, and clinking wine glasses. Hey, if you're enjoying this story, go ahead and drop a like to help us grow even more. And let me know in the comments. On a scale from 0 to 10, what score would you give this story so far? Your feedback makes all the difference. Her seat was in the center of the room, painfully exposed. She slid into the chair, heart hammering, and checked her phone. 7:02, her date was already late. At the next table, almost close enough to touch, sat a woman with sleek black hair tied in a perfect low bun, a tailored black suit hugging her body in all the right places. She wasn't alone. She was having dinner with 2 older men, both clearly trying to impress her. But the woman barely paid them any attention. Her dark eyes were focused, cold, calculating, powerful. The kind of woman who didn't wait for anyone. The kind of woman Sabrina had only seen in movies. The kind of woman who could crush a heart just by looking at it. Sabrina tried not to stare. She looked down at her cracked phone screen again. 7:11, still no Tess. Her $20 sat in her purse like a ticking time bomb. Maybe she should just leave. Maybe this was a prank. Or worse. Maybe she'd been stood up again. She could feel the sting behind her eyes, the humiliation clawing at her throat. A waiter approached. "Would you like to order a drink while you wait?" Sabrina blinked. Just water, please." The waiter nodded politely and walked away, not even pretending to hide his amusement. At the next table, the woman in the black suit tilted her head slightly, eyes shifting just enough to watch Sabrina. Subtle, calculated, curious. The men across from her were still talking, one of them laughing too loudly at his own joke. But the woman didn't laugh. She was watching Sabrina. Sabrina shifted uncomfortably, crossing her arms to hide the tiny hole in her sleeve. Her phone lit up. A message. "Tess, sorry. Something came up. Rain check." The world slowed. Rain check. 2 words. No apology, no reschedule, just rejection again. She closed her eyes, tried to breathe. She could feel the tears coming, but she swallowed them down. Not here. Not in this place. She pushed the phone back into her purse and sat frozen for a long moment, unsure of what to do next. Then the waiter returned with her water and a glass of red wine. "I didn't order this," she said quietly. The waiter smiled. Compliments of the lady at the next table. Sabrina turned, startled. The woman in the black suit raised her glass ever so slightly. Their eyes met for the first time, and something shifted. Not a smile. Not yet. But there was a pull, a gravity. The woman nodded once, then returned to her conversation like nothing had happened. Sabrina's throat tightened. Confused, curious, a little breathless. Who the hell was she? And why did her gaze feel like a spark lighting something long dead inside her chest? Sabrina stared at the deep red wine glistening in the crystal glass before her like it had arrived from another universe. She didn't touch it, not yet. It felt like a trap or a joke or something that didn't belong to her world, but her fingers itched to hold it. Her lips wanted to taste it. Her eyes, however, drifted back to the woman in the black suit. The woman was speaking again, her voice low and controlled as she addressed the two men, but her gaze flipped sideways for the briefest second. Sabrina caught it. It was deliberate, a choice, and it made her skin prickle. She looked away quickly, heart pounding, pulse fluttering at her throat. What the hell was happening? She hadn't planned for this. She'd barely made it through the front door without tripping over her own anxiety. And now some goddess in Armani was sending her wine and looking at her like she was an unsolved puzzle worth breaking apart. Sabrina reached for the glass. Her fingers curled around the stem slowly as if touching something sacred. It was heavier than she expected. Cool, luxurious. She brought it to her lips, took a tentative sip. The wine was smooth, rich, like velvet sliding over her tongue. She closed her eyes just for a second as the warmth of it bloomed in her chest. She wasn't sure if it was the alcohol or the woman, probably both. When she opened her eyes, the woman was standing, her chair pushed back without a sound, her body moving with precise grace. The two men rose with her, still chattering like overexcited lap dogs, but she gave them a single nod and stepped away. And then she turned and walked straight to Sabrina's table. Every atom in Sabrina's body froze. The restaurant fell away. All the polished silverware and laughing patrons, the clinking glasses and gentle music, they became white noise as those sharp black heels stopped beside her table. The woman looked down at her, not unkindly, not with pity, just interested. Did she stand you up? Her voice was smooth. Low. The kind of voice you didn't hear so much as feel. Sabrina swallowed. Looks like it. Shame. The woman's lips curved just slightly. May I? She gestured to the empty seat across from Sabrina. She couldn't speak, could barely breathe. She nodded. The woman sat, every motion elegant, calculated. Her eyes never left Sabrina's. I hope you don't mind. I hate eating alone. Sabrina laughed before she could stop herself. I'm sure you had very enthusiastic company. They weren't listening, just performing. Her eyes flicked to the wine. You drank it? Yeah. I mean, thank you. You didn't have to. I wanted to. Silence stretched between them. Not awkward, tense, electric. You don't seem like someone who belongs here, the woman said finally, voice soft. Sabrina flushed. Thanks. It's not an insult. You're real. That's rare. Sabrina tried to smile. Well, I'm definitely really out of my depth. Are you? Her eyes narrowed just slightly because you're sitting here in a place you can't afford after being stood up and yet you haven't run. I was about to, but you didn't. The woman leaned forward just slightly, just enough. I like that. You don't even know me. Not yet. She extended a hand across the table. Aurelia Voss. Sabrina stared at it for a beat. Too long, then shook it. Her fingers trembled. Aurelia's were warm. Strong. Sabrina Moreno. Well, Sabrina Moreno. Aurelia's lips curved again, slightly more this time. Would you like to eat with me? Sabrina blinked. You're serious? I don't joke about food. Sabrina hesitated, then nodded. Okay. Aurelia raised her hand slightly and instantly a waiter appeared like magic. We'll have the chef's tasting menu and another glass for the lady. Yes, Miss Voss. He vanished. Sabrina stared at her. Miss Voss, she repeated slowly. Wait, as in Voss Dynamics? Aurelia didn't respond, just sipped her wine, watching her over the rim. Sabrina's stomach dropped. Oh, God. She wasn't just rich. She was that rich. The kind of rich that owned buildings, cities, futures. Sabrina looked down at her clothes, at the worn cuffs of her blazer, the scuffed shoes, the hair she tried to tame with water and hope. I shouldn't be here, but you are. This is insane. Maybe, but I'm not asking for forever. Just dinner. The food arrived. Tiny plates, beautiful and strange. Sabrina barely tasted the first few bites, her nerves too loud. But Aurelia spoke again, asking quiet, careful questions about her life, her dreams, her art. And Sabrina answered slowly at first, then with more color. She didn't even realize she was smiling until Aurelia smiled back. The wine flowed, the food kept coming, and so did the conversation. And somewhere between the third course and dessert, something changed. Aurelia leaned in, her gaze softer now. You have fire in you, Sabrina, even if you don't see it. Sabrina swallowed, her throat thick. You don't know me. Not yet. She tilted her head, her voice quieter. But I want to. Sabrina couldn't speak. Her whole body felt like it was humming. She was no one. A broke artist from a broken apartment who had $20 and a heart full of disappointment. And yet this woman, this force of a woman, was looking at her like she mattered, like she was something worth tasting slowly. Why me? She asked, voice a whisper. Aurelia looked at her for a long moment. Because you looked like you were about to cry and then you didn't. Sabrina let out a shaky laugh. That's it. That's everything. And just like that, the air between them changed. There was a new silence. One full of questions neither dared to ask yet. But they both felt the weight of it. The beginning, the shift, the flicker of something dangerous and beautiful and completely impossible. The night air hit Sabrina's cheeks like a bomb as she stepped out of the restaurant. The warmth of the wine still lingering in her veins. The taste of expensive food and forbidden attention clinging to her tongue. Aurelia followed a few steps behind, her heels clicking softly on the pavement like the slow, measured beat of a war drum. Sabrina didn't know where to look, what to say. Her head was spinning, not just from the alcohol, but from her. The night had gone from disaster to dream in less than an hour, and the dream was standing too close, too real, too magnetic. Let me call you a car, Aurelia said calmly, her voice now stripped of its sharpness, replaced by something quieter, almost gentle. Sabrina shook her head embarrassed. No, I'm okay. I'll take the train. Aurelia arched one perfect brow. The train? Yeah, it's not that bad at night. I mean, it is bad, but I've survived worse. She tried to smile. Aurelia didn't return it. She simply studied her in that maddening, unflinching way. You shouldn't be taking the train this late. I've done it 100 times. Doesn't mean you should have to. Sabrina felt herself flush. That's life. No, Aurelia stepped closer. That's your life, but not the one you deserve. The words hit harder than they should have. Like Aurelia had reached into her chest and touched something raw. I don't need saving, Sabrina said, sharper than she intended. Aurelia didn't flinch. I didn't say you did. You don't know me. You don't know what I've had to. She stopped herself. Her voice cracked. Aurelia's gaze softened just a fraction. You're right. I don't know your story. Not yet. But I want to. Sabrina blinked at her. Why? Because you're different. Different how? Aurelia tilted her head slightly, her eyes locked onto Sabrina's with frightening precision. You made me feel something tonight. I don't remember the last time that happened. Sabrina looked down at her shoes. At the scuffed edges, the frayed laces, the duct tape. I'm not someone like you. Your power. You walk into a room and everyone notices. You probably own this city. Aurelia didn't deny it. She only stepped closer. And yet, I noticed you. Sabrina's breath snagged. The streetlight above them flickered. Her whole body felt wired, electric. She wanted to run. She wanted to stay. She wanted to believe this was real, even as her instincts screamed it couldn't be. What happens now? She asked, almost afraid of the answer. Aurelia considered her. That depends. I'm not going to force anything. But if you'll let me, I'd like to see you again. Sabrina laughed, bitter, small. I don't think I belong in your world. Then let me visit yours. Sabrina stared. What, come over for ramen and broken furniture? Exactly that. There was no sarcasm in Aurelia's voice. No mockery. Only sincerity. Sabrina didn't know where to set it down inside her. This doesn't make sense, she said. Good. Aurelia's smile was small, crooked, devastating. The best things never do. A car slid to the curb, sleek, black, quiet. The driver stepped out and waited without a word. Aurelia glanced at the car, then back at her. You're sure you won't let me give you a ride? Sabrina hesitated, then shook her head. Not tonight. Aurelia nodded as if she respected it. As if she understood. Then at least let me give you this. She drew a card from her coat pocket and held it out. Simple, elegant. Her name in silver, a private number. Call me, she said. Not a demand, a request, a challenge. Why? Sabrina asked again because she couldn't help it. Aurelia leaned in. So close. Sabrina could feel the warmth of her breath. Because I'm not done looking at you yet. And then she stepped away, slid into the car, and disappeared into the night. Sabrina stood there, card in hand, heart in pieces. Everything felt surreal, impossible, dangerous, and yet she couldn't stop the smile that broke through her uncertainty, or the fact that her fingers refused to let go of that card. That night, back in her apartment with peeling walls and a leaky faucet, Sabrina sat on her creaky bed, staring at her cracked ceiling, still tasting the wine and the weight of Aurelia's gaze. She didn't call. Not yet. But she kept the card under her pillow just in case. 3 days passed. 3 long, achingly slow, emotionally turbulent days. Sabrina carried Aurelia's card everywhere. First in her pocket, then in her wallet, then under her pillow again. She hadn't called, not because she didn't want to. She did desperately, but every time she held the card in her hands, she saw herself through Aurelia's eyes, or worse, through her own. She saw her peeling apartment walls, the leaky sink that hissed like a snake every time she brushed her teeth, the collection of mismatched mugs and chipped plates that made up her kitchenware. She saw the hollow place in her fridge where groceries should have been and the paint-stained jeans draped over the chair in the corner of her room. What would someone like Aurelia want with someone like her? A powerful woman who probably lived in a penthouse whose wine cost more than Sabrina's rent, who moved through the world with elegance and danger like it belonged to her. And still Sabrina couldn't stop thinking about her. The sound of her voice, the sharpness in her gaze. The quiet moment when she said, "Because I'm not done looking at you yet." On the 4th morning, Sabrina woke up late, tangled in her blanket, hair a mess. Dreams full of Aurelia's silhouette. She lay there for too long, staring at the cracked ceiling, her heart already racing with indecision. And then her phone buzzed. Unknown number, 1 message. Coffee. Today, noon. Milo's on 7th. Come if you want to. No name, but she didn't need one. Her fingers gripped the phone so tightly it left little half-moons in her palm. The clock said 10:43. She had barely over an hour. Her legs moved before her brain did. She threw herself out of bed, splashed cold water on her face, rifled through a laundry basket of cleanish clothes and yanked on jeans, a sweater that didn't have holes, and her only pair of decent boots. She brushed her hair into some semblance of order, and tried not to overthink, which was impossible because all she could think was, why is she doing this? What does she want? What if it's all a game? But she still ran the 4 blocks to Milo with her heart in her throat. The cafe was small, cozy, with foggy windows and a soft scent of cinnamon and espresso in the air. She almost didn't see Aurelia at first. She was tucked into a corner booth, dressed down in a leather jacket and dark jeans, her hair loose, curling slightly at the ends. Casual, stunning, dangerous. Sabrina froze for half a breath. And then Aurelia looked up. Their eyes met. And it was like that night all over again. Electric. Sabrina walked over slowly, heart hammering in her chest. Aurelia said nothing, just watched her, gaze unreadable until Sabrina slid into the seat across from her. "Hi," Sabrina said breathless. Aurelia nodded once. "You came. You texted. You didn't call. Neither did you." Aurelia's mouth twitched to Shay. Silence again, charged. "I didn't think you would," Aurelia added after a moment. I almost didn't." "Why did you?" Sabrina hesitated. "Because I couldn't stop thinking about you." That admission landed heavy between them. Aurelia didn't flinch, but her eyes darkened. "Just a little." "Good," she said, then gestured toward the counter. "I ordered for you. I hope you like vanilla." Yeah, I do." "I know." "How?" "I asked the waiter that night." "Of course you did." Sabrina shook her head, smiling despite herself. The barista brought over 2 mugs, 1 black coffee, 1 with cream and foam, and a dusting of cinnamon. Sabrina curled her hands around the warmth of hers. "So," she said, trying to sound braver than she felt. "What is this?" Aurelia raised an eyebrow. "Coffee. You know what I mean?" "Yes, I do." She leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice low. "I don't do things like this, Sabrina. I don't send drinks to strangers. I don't invite them to dinner. I don't text them. I haven't done this in a long time." "Done what?" "Wanted something that wasn't already mine." Sabrina's breath caught. "And you think I'm something you want?" Aurelia's eyes dropped to her lips for a fraction of a second. "I know it." The air between them felt too tight. Sabrina looked down, suddenly overwhelmed. "You say all the right things." "No," Aurelia said, "I say the true things. They just sound good when they come out of my mouth." That made Sabrina laugh. Really laugh. Aurelia smiled at the sound. It softened something in her face. So, what now? Sabrina asked after a moment. What do you want from me? Aurelia's smile faded slightly. She looked down at her own coffee. I want to spend time with you. I want to know what makes you laugh. What makes you sad? I want to know why you look like you've been carrying something heavy for years. Sabrina's throat tightened. That's a lot. You don't have to give me anything you don't want to. I'm not here to take. I'm here to see. Sabrina blinked at her. Her chest hurt. Why me? She whispered. Aurelia looked at her like she was the only person in the cafe. Because you're not afraid to feel. And because something in you is trying to come back to life. Sabrina didn't answer. Couldn't. The tears were close. Too close. She sipped her coffee to hide it. Aurelia sat back, giving her space, respecting the silence. They finished their drinks in companionable quiet. And when they stood to leave, Aurelia didn't try to kiss her or hold her hand. She simply said, tomorrow, dinner, my place. Why? Sabrina asked again. Because I want to see what you look like under soft light. And then she walked away. The apartment building didn't look like any place Sabrina had ever stepped foot in. The doorman wore a tailored uniform. The lobby had floors of polished marble and impossibly tall windows, and the elevator was lined with mirrored gold. Everything shimmered with quiet opulence. She almost turned back 3 times between the sidewalk and the top floor. Almost. But curiosity, dangerous, delicious, irresistible, won out. She pressed the penthouse button and rode in silence, gripping her tote bag like a shield. Inside was a bottle of cheap red wine she'd bought with the last of her tips because showing up empty-handed felt wrong, and she had nothing else that even resembled a gift. The elevator opened directly into Aurelia's home. No hallway, no buzzer, just her standing barefoot in the middle of a vast living room that looked like it had been designed by a magazine editor. Dressed in a loose black blouse. Her dark hair cascading over her shoulders in soft, wild waves. Sabrina stopped breathing. Aurelia didn't move for a moment, just looked at her like she was the only thing in the world she wanted to see. Then she smiled. Small, controlled, dangerous. You came. Sabrina stepped out slowly, unsure where to look. The floor was glass. The city lights sparkled beneath it like stars trapped below her feet. I brought wine, she mumbled, holding it out like a peace offering. Aurelia took it with both hands, holding it like it was worth more than it was. Perfect. It's definitely not. You are. Sabrina looked at her sharply. You're going to keep saying things like that until I believe them, aren't you? Aurelia arched an eyebrow. Maybe you're impossible. And you're here. Aurelia turned without another word and walked barefoot across the glass floor, her body moving with casual elegance. Sabrina followed, trying not to look like a tourist in a life that didn't belong to her. The kitchen was all sleek lines and chrome, but warm, too. Soft lighting, the scent of herbs in the air. You cooked? Sabrina asked, surprised. Aurelia glanced over her shoulder. Do I look like I don't know how to feed someone properly? Honestly, Sabrina grinned. You look like someone who is a private chef and never touches a stove. Aurelia laughed low and unexpected. Touché. She handed Sabrina a glass of wine and gestured for her to sit. But I do cook when it's worth it. And tonight as Aurelia didn't answer right away. Instead, she began plating food, pasta made fresh, crusty bread still warm, roasted vegetables arranged like art. Then she brought everything to the table and sat across from her. Tonight, she said softly, I wanted to feel like a person, not a job, not a name, just a woman having dinner with someone who doesn't want anything from her. Sabrina's expression softened. And you think I don't want anything? Aurelia looked at her directly. You want to be seen, not bought, not used, not measured, just seen. The words slid into the air between them and settled like heat on Sabrina's skin. She picked up her fork, suddenly shy. So, what do you see when you look at me? Aurelia tilted her head, studied her. I see a woman who's trying to stay small so the world doesn't notice how bright she really is. A woman who's been told she's too much or not enough and believed both. A woman who feels like everything's been taken from her before she even had a chance to hold it. Sabrina's throat closed. Her appetite vanished. The words hit too deep, too fast. Aurelia noticed. She reached across the table, not to touch her, but just close enough that Sabrina felt the warmth of her presence. Tell me if I'm wrong. Sabrina shook her head, eyes burning. You're not. Aurelia pulled her hand back slowly. Good. I hate being wrong. Dinner was slower after that. Quieter, but not in a bad way. There were long stretches of silence that didn't feel empty. Aurelia asked about her art. Real questions, not small talk, and listened with the kind of attention that made Sabrina feel exposed. Seeing it terrified her. And yet she found herself answering honestly about her father leaving, about her mother working 2 jobs, about growing up hungry but trying to create beauty out of scraps. She didn't know why she was telling Aurelia all this. Maybe it was the wine. Maybe it was the view. Maybe it was the fact that for the first time in years, someone was looking at her like she wasn't broken. After dessert, dark chocolate and berries, Aurelia stood. Come here, she said. Sabrina hesitated. Why? Because I want to show you something. They walked to the wall of windows where the city glittered like a sea of secrets. Aurelia flicked a switch and the lights dimmed until they were wrapped in a soft golden glow. She stood beside Sabrina, close but not touching. I come here when I can't breathe, she said quietly. When I feel like I'm disappearing you. Sabrina turned toward her. You're like the woman. You own this world. No, Aurelia said, her voice barely a whisper. I know how to survive in it. That's not the same thing. Sabrina didn't know what to say to that, so she said nothing. Just stood beside her in silence. Then Aurelia turned and the space between them vanished. Her fingers brushed Sabrina's wrist, barely a touch, but Sabrina shivered. Aurelia's voice was low, trembling with something unspoken. May I? Sabrina nodded, and Aurelia leaned in, slow, deliberate, until her lips touched Sabrina's. Not rushed, not demanding, just there, warm, testing, waiting. Sabrina melted. The kiss deepened, lips parting, breath mingling. Aurelia's hand cupped her face, firm but gentle, while Sabrina clutched at her blouse like she was afraid she'd vanish. When they pulled apart, both were breathless. The city pulsed beneath them. Aurelia rested her forehead against Sabrina's. You taste like the kind of trouble I want to drown in. Sabrina laughed shakily. You should know I'm a mess. Aurelia smiled. Good. I'm tired of perfection. They stayed there pressed together, heartbeat to heartbeat, as the city burned around them and the night held its breath. Sabrina didn't sleep that night. Not because she stayed at Aurelia's. She hadn't. After the kiss, they'd lingered in silence, fingers barely touching until Aurelia whispered, not yet. The words weren't rejection. They were restraint, respect, a line drawn by someone who knew how dangerous crossing it too fast could be. Aurelia had called her a car, not a town car, not a luxury SUV, a regular taxi, at Sabrina's quiet insistence. And when she got home, still tasting Aurelia's kiss on her lips, her heart pounded like a drum in a war she hadn't realized she'd enlisted in. She lay on her narrow mattress, staring at the ceiling, eyes wide in the dark, remembering everything. The heat of Aurelia's hands. The tight set of her jaw when she spoke about needing to feel like a person, the way she'd said. You taste like the kind of trouble I want to drown in. It had sounded like confession and prophecy at once, and it terrified her. Because none of this had been part of any plan. She hadn't wanted this. Sabrina had been surviving, quietly, efficiently, just keeping her head above water. Aurelia was a storm, and some reckless, treacherous part of her wanted to drown in it, too. By morning, she still hadn't decided what any of it meant. Then her phone buzzed. A new message. Saturday noon. Come with me. Don't ask where. No punctuation, no signature, just the same number. Aurelia. Sabrina stared at the screen. It was Friday, less than 24 hours away. Her fingers hovered over the keys for long minutes before she typed, "What should I wear?" The reply came instantly. Something that feels like armor but lets you breathe. She had no idea what that meant, but the thought of Aurelia picturing her in anything twisted her stomach with equal parts anticipation and dread. Saturday arrived like a warning. Sabrina spent the morning pacing, changing, cursing herself, changing again. She finally settled on black jeans, boots, and a worn leather jacket over a dark red top that clung just enough to make her feel strong. Not sexy, not polished, just present. When the car pulled up, she recognized the driver, the same man who'd handled Aurelia's car outside the restaurant. He didn't speak, only nodded. 30 minutes later, they were past the city limits, then winding through hills, then beyond a private gate with no signage. The car stopped before a sprawling estate carved into the cliffs above the water. It wasn't flashy. It was architectural poetry, brutal and beautiful at once. And Aurelia stood at the entrance, wind in her hair, dressed in black again, always. But this time it wasn't the perfect CEO uniform. She wore boots, leather gloves, a long tailored coat. She looked like she belonged in a film or on a battlefield. Sabrina stepped out slowly, heart hammering. "Where are we?" she asked. Aurelia didn't answer. She just turned and tipped her head toward the cliff's edge. Sabrina followed, boots crunching over gravel, until they reached a large metal door set into the hillside. Aurelia pressed a code. The door hissed open and inside an art gallery hidden underground concrete and glass. Spotlights casting long shadows across the space. But it wasn't just any gallery. The walls were lined with paintings, not famous ones. Not collected, personal, raw, experimental. "These are yours," Sabrina whispered, stepping closer to a canvas splashed in violent red. Aurelia's voice was quiet behind her. "No, they're my mother's." Sabrina turned slowly. "Your mother was an artist?" Aurelia corrected. "She doesn't paint anymore. She doesn't do anything anymore. Early onset dementia." The words landed like stones. Aurelia didn't look at her, just walked slowly into the gallery, hands in her coat pockets. "She was the only person who ever really saw me. Before all this, before the company, the headlines, she taught me how to be soft. Before I had to be sharp." Sabrina followed her in silence. "Why are you showing me this?" Aurelia finally looked at her. "Because I need you to understand something." "What?" "That I come from broken things, too." The air between them thickened. Sabrina's throat felt tight. She didn't speak, afraid her voice would betray too much. Aurelia continued walking. "I bought this land because it's the only place I feel close to her. I built this gallery to protect her work. Not for the world, just for me. For the part of me I'm terrified to let anyone see." "Why me?" Sabrina asked, the question rising again like a wound that never closed. Aurelia turned, walked toward her slowly. "Because you're not afraid to hurt. Because you let the pain show, and because I'm tired of hiding all the ways I've bled to survive." When they stopped inches apart, Sabrina felt every beat of her own heart echo in her ribs. "You scare me," she whispered. Aurelia's voice was low. "You scare me, too." Sabrina shook her head. "You're dangerous. And you're not." Aurelia smiled barely. "You walked into that restaurant with $20 and sat alone in the middle of a room full of people who would have eaten you alive. That's dangerous, Sabrina." The name landed like a caress on Aurelia's tongue. Then she reached out, brushing a strand of hair from Sabrina's cheek. "I didn't bring you here to impress you. I brought you here because if I don't show you who I really am, I don't deserve to touch you again." Sabrina's eyes burned. No one had ever looked at her like that. Not with hunger, not with reverence, not with fear. "Touch me now," she said, breathless. Aurelia did. Her hands were firmer this time, urgent, but controlled. The kiss wasn't soft. It was fire, messy, desperate. Sabrina wrapped her arms around her neck, pulled her close, let herself be consumed. And this time, neither of them pulled away. They kissed until the shadows shifted, until the past echoed less, until the only thing left in the world was the sound of two hearts refusing to break alone. The next morning came in pieces. Soft light pouring through the enormous windows. The subtle rustle of sheets, a scent Sabrina couldn't quite name. Clean skin, citrus, faint perfume, and something uniquely Aurelia. Sabrina lay still for a moment, disoriented. Her heart was beating too fast, her body too aware of the way warmth clung to her along her arms. Her back, her legs, and then she felt it, the weight of another body behind her. Aurelia's arm wrapped possessively around her waist. Her breath slow, steady, brushing against the curve of Sabrina's neck. They had fallen asleep tangled, limbs like vines, like the only way to survive the night was to hold on until morning. And somehow they had. Slowly, gently, Sabrina turned her head just enough to look at her. Aurelia was still asleep. Her dark hair spread across the pillow, lips parted slightly. The harsh edge of her usual expression completely gone. She looked younger, softer, vulnerable in a way that made Sabrina ache. She couldn't believe she was here in this bed, in this home with this woman, a CEO, a storm, a mystery, and yet in this moment, just a woman breathing beside her. Not perfect, not untouchable, just real. Last night played in her mind like a film. Slow, hot, undeniable. The way Aurelia kissed her like she was trying to memorize her mouth. The way she'd whispered her name over and over like a prayer and a curse. The way they'd held each other long after the urgency had passed. But now, in the calm, doubt returned. Sabrina slipped out of the bed quietly, careful not to wake her. She found her clothes folded neatly on a bench near the window. Aurelia had done that. Of course she had. The kind of woman who noticed everything, even the quiet chaos inside someone else. Sabrina pulled on her jeans and sweater, finger combing her hair into some kind of order. She stood by the window, looking out at the cliffs, the water crashing far below, the world that felt so impossibly far from her own. What was she doing? This wasn't her life. She was an accident in this world, temporary. Aurelia stirred behind her. Sabrina turned and saw her sitting up, sheets tangled around her waist, hair wild, eyes heavy with sleep and something else, something unreadable. You were trying to leave. The voice wasn't accusatory, just quiet, observant. I wasn't sure if I should still be here, Sabrina admitted. Aurelia nodded once. That makes two of us. Sabrina blinked. You scare me? Aurelia said, running a hand through her hair. You don't know how rare that is. Because I'm broke and don't fit in your world. No, Aurelia stood slowly, completely unbothered by her nakedness, wrapping herself in a black silk robe. Because you make me feel like myself, and I don't know what to do with that. The honesty in her voice hit Sabrina harder than anything else. She crossed the room, stood in front of her. I don't know what this is. Neither do I, Aurelia admitted. But I don't want to stop. Even if it gets messy, especially if it does. They stared at each other for a long, fragile moment. And then Sabrina leaned in. Not a kiss, just her forehead pressed gently against Aurelia's. A quiet I'm still here. Aurelia let out a breath she didn't know she was holding. Stay, she whispered. At least for coffee. Sabrina smiled. Do you even know how to make coffee? Aurelia smirked. I know how to have it delivered. They shared that laugh raw and real. And something in the air shifted again. It wasn't about sex now or heat or power. It was about two people trying to figure out how to be seen without falling apart. The day moved slowly. They made breakfast. Well, Sabrina cooked while Aurelia stole bites and leaned against the counter like a smug cat. They talked, not in circles, not in flirtation, just real about childhoods, about pain, about the fear of being too much and never enough. I don't let people in, Aurelia said at one point, eyes locked on hers. Ever. Why me? Sabrina asked again, unable to stop herself. Aurelia's gaze softened. Because I built empires and ruined people and never once felt guilty. But when I kissed you that first time, I felt terrified I'd ruin you. Sabrina didn't know what to say. So, she just touched her hand, and Aurelia didn't pull away. When it was time to leave, the goodbye came slower. No rush, no pretense, just two women standing too close. Not ready to let go. I want to see you again, Aurelia said. You will, Sabrina replied. But as she walked out the door, the doubt returned like a shadow. This was real. Too real. And real things broke. As the elevator closed, Sabrina clutched the strap of her bag and tried not to fall in love with a woman who could destroy her with a glance. Sabrina tried to return to her routine, but nothing fit anymore. The tiny apartment that once felt like a protective shell now pressed against her like a cage. The paint on the walls seemed more chipped. The faucet louder, the silence heavier. Her studio, her sacred corner, where she painted through pain and hunger felt hollow. She picked up her brush, stared at a blank canvas, and for the first time in months, nothing came. Her hand wouldn't move. Her chest was too full of what she didn't know. Maybe fear, maybe Aurelia, maybe both. She hadn't seen her in 5 days, not because they were ignoring each other. Aurelia had texted simple things. Thinking about you. Today's hell. Wish I could escape to that moment with you by the window. I miss your voice. And Sabrina had replied briefly, honestly, but never starting the conversation. She was afraid of what this was, of what it could become, of how it could break her, or worse, how it could change her. But on the 6th day, Sabrina walked out of work exhausted, paint on her jeans, sweat on her neck, and found a black car parked across the street. The window rolled down slowly. Aurelia, no words, just a look, a silent question. Sabrina walked over and opened the door, slid inside. Neither of them spoke for a while. Aurelia didn't reach for her, didn't smile, just drove out of the city, past the noise, past the chaos until they reached a quiet road lined with trees and a lake shimmering beneath the dusk sky. She parked, killed the engine, and turned toward Sabrina. Her voice was low, tense. Tell me what you're afraid of. Sabrina stared at her hands. You. Aurelia's expression didn't change, but her jaw tightened. Why? Because I like who I am when I'm around you, but I don't know who that is. Aurelia said nothing. Sabrina continued, her voice growing rougher. You walk into a room and the world bends around you. You know who you are. I've spent years trying to convince myself I mattered, that I didn't have to become invisible to be safe. And then you. She stopped shaking her head. You see me and I want to let you, but I'm afraid that if you get too close, I'll lose everything I've built just to stand on my own 2 feet. Silence filled the car. Heavy cracking at the edges. Then Aurelia whispered, I spent most of my life making sure no one could get close enough to hurt me. I built walls so high even I couldn't see over them. And then you sat across from me in that restaurant. And I knew her voice broke just for a second. I knew if I let you in, you'd ruin all of it. And I wanted it anyway. Sabrina looked at her. Why me? Aurelia let out a bitter laugh. You keep asking that like I've made a mistake. Because it feels like a mistake. Like I'm temporary. Like this ends with you remembering who you are and realizing I don't fit. Aurelia turned in her seat, reached for her hand, took it, held it tight. I've spent years being everything to everyone. Powerful, controlled, untouchable. But you, she swallowed hard. You're the first thing I've wanted in a very long time. Not because you're easy, but because you're not. You challenge me. You make me want to feel. And I've built an empire on not feeling. Sabrina blinked against the sting in her eyes. Then tell me this won't hurt. I can't. Why not? Because anything worth having might hurt. But I promise you this. I won't leave just because I get scared. And I won't let you leave just because you are. That undid her. Something inside her broke open. And before she could stop herself, Sabrina leaned across the center console and kissed her. Not soft, not sweet, fierce. Like she was saying all the things she didn't have the language for. Aurelia responded in kind, grabbing the back of her neck, pulling her in deeper, kissing her like she needed it to breathe. They didn't stop. Not until the windows fogged and their bodies trembled, and every breath was a gasp. They didn't go back to the city that night. Aurelia drove them to a small cabin she owned near the lake, a place she said she hadn't brought anyone to in over 10 years. There was no Wi-Fi, no security, just silence. And for 2 nights, they existed in it. No phones, no titles, no expectations. They cooked, bathed together, talked about fears and dreams and regrets. They kissed until their lips ached, and held each other like they were learning how to be human again. But on the morning of the 3rd day, Sabrina found Aurelia outside, standing at the edge of the dock, her phone pressed to her ear, her expression hard. Cold professional, like the woman from the restaurant had returned. No. Tell him if the board wants my vote, they'll wait. I'm not flying back early. A pause, a colder tone. Then tell the board to burn. She hung up, turned, saw Sabrina, and for a split second her face cracked. Regret, guilt, conflict. Sabrina walked toward her slowly. Do you need to go? Aurelia hesitated. They'll wait. I said what I said. But you didn't want to say it. I wanted to be here more. And when that's not enough, Aurelia looked down at the water. Then we talk about what comes next. Sabrina didn't answer, just stepped beside her. Slipped her hand into Aurelia's, held on. And the wind carried the promise of something neither of them was ready to name, but both of them were terrified to lose. The return to the city was silent, not because there was nothing to say. On the contrary, the air inside the car was heavy with unspoken words, but neither Sabrina nor Aurelia dared to shatter the fragile quiet they'd built between them over the last few days. The cabin had been a dream, a suspended reality. But now the skyline loomed again, familiar and cruel, a reminder that real life waited with teeth bared. Aurelia's phone buzzed incessantly in the center console. Each vibration was like a needle pressed against Sabrina's skin. And though Aurelia ignored it, her jaw was clenched, her shoulders tight. She was back in armor, and Sabrina felt it like a door gently closing between them. When the car stopped in front of Sabrina's apartment, neither of them moved at first. Then Aurelia turned, eyes scanning her face. I want to see you tomorrow night, dinner at mine. Her voice was steady, controlled, like it had been rehearsed. Sabrina hesitated. Are you sure you'll have time? Aurelia's expression flickered. I'll make it, even if the board burns. That earned the ghost of a smile. Let them burn slower. Sabrina laughed, but it didn't reach her chest. Okay, she said. Tomorrow. She leaned in, kissed Aurelia softly, brief, but meaningful, and stepped out of the car. She didn't look back. The next morning, Sabrina woke to news she hadn't expected. Not about Aurelia. Not yet, but about herself. She had submitted 3 pieces months ago to a local emerging artist showcase. She had almost forgotten about it. Convinced they'd been overlooked or dismissed, but they'd been accepted. Not only accepted, she'd been offered a small solo feature in a downtown gallery, one of the few indie spaces left in the city. Her name, her art, her night. She stared at the email in shock, her breath caught in her throat. It didn't feel real. She didn't know if she should scream, cry, or collapse. Instead, she texted the only person who'd believe in her more than she did. Nina, holy, you did it. I knew you would. I'm bringing balloons and maybe a mini donkey. Sabrina laughed through her tears. She wanted to tell Aurelia immediately, but a part of her hesitated. Would this matter to her? Would it feel small in comparison to everything Aurelia touched, or would she be proud? She drafted the message 5 times before sending the simplest version. I got accepted into the Vesper Row Gallery. My own little corner. The show is next month. Minutes passed. Nothing. An hour. Still nothing. Sabrina told herself Aurelia was busy, that she'd respond when she could. But the pit in her stomach twisted tighter. That evening, Sabrina arrived at Aurelia's penthouse for dinner. But the energy was different. The lights were dimmer. The room colder. And Aurelia was already drinking wine, deep red poured into a glass. She didn't bother to sit down. Hey, Sabrina said cautiously, slipping off her jacket. Rough day. Aurelia turned slow. She looked exhausted. Pale. Her usual polish dulled. You could say that. What happened? The board moved up the vote. One of the partners leaked confidential documents. The press is circling. I had to fire someone I've worked with for 10 years. Her voice was flat, emotionless. And now I'm being told I need to step back. At least temporarily to keep the company's reputation intact. Sabrina blinked. Wait, what? You're stepping down. Not officially, just publicly invisible. She drained the glass. The optics matter more than the truth. Sabrina walked toward her slow. I'm sorry. That's God. That's awful. Aurelia set the glass down. Her eyes found Sabrina's. It's not your fault. But something in her tone said, it still hurts anyway. Sabrina reached out to touch her, but Aurelia stepped back. Subtle, but it stung. I also saw a message, she added. About the gallery. Sabrina swallowed. Yeah, I didn't want to bother you. You weren't. But her voice didn't carry the warmth Sabrina had hoped for. I should be happy for you, Aurelia said, almost to herself. But all I can think about is how I'm unraveling while you're rising. The words cut deeper than either of them intended. Sabrina froze. Is that what you think this is? Competition? No, Aurelia looked away. It's not rational. It's just I've spent so long building everything. Controlling everything, and now I can't stop it from falling apart. And I don't know how to exist in someone else's joy when I'm drowning in my own failure. Sabrina's voice broke. Then say that don't punish me for being proud of something. I'm not. You are. She stepped closer. You're scared and you're pushing me away before I can see the cracks. Aurelia met her gaze, jaw tight. What if the cracks are all that's left? Then let me see them anyway. They stood in silence, breathing hard, 2 storms colliding. And then Aurelia whispered, I don't know how to do this. Sabrina stepped into her space. Neither do I, but I'm still here. Aurelia closed her eyes. I don't want to lose you. Then don't. I'm not used to needing anyone. You don't need me, Sabrina said softly. But maybe you want me. And that's enough. Finally, Aurelia reached for her, pulled her in, held her like a woman who had lost too much too often and didn't want to lose again. And Sabrina let herself be held. Let herself believe for one more night that wanting could be stronger than fear. But deep down both of them knew the fall was coming. And neither of them was ready for the landing. Sabrina hadn't planned to cry in the middle of a hardware store. But there she was, aisle 5, standing between buckets of white primer and overpriced brushes, phone shaking in her hand, tears burning behind her eyes. The gallery had called. The pipes in their exhibit wing had burst overnight. Water damage, mold risk, fire inspection. The Vesper Row show was being postponed indefinitely, maybe cancelled altogether. She barely heard the words past the ringing in her ears. Her solo night, her first real shot, gone. Sabrina lowered the phone and stared at the cement floor like it could give her a reason to keep breathing. Everything she'd painted, everything she'd put into this was back in limbo. Her knees felt weak. Her heart felt like it had dropped into her stomach and shattered. And all she wanted all at once was to call Aurelia, to hear her voice. But she didn't. Not after the way they'd left things. Aurelia had held her like she was made of glass and then disappeared again the next day. No text, no call, not even a message from her assistant. The last thing Sabrina needed was to beg for attention from a woman who didn't know how to stay. Instead, she wiped her face with a sleeve of her hoodie, paid for her brushes with a few dollars she had left, and walked out into the cold gray of late afternoon with paint and heartbreak in her bag. By the time she got home, Nina was waiting on the couch with 2 mugs of tea and a look that said she already knew. "You didn't even have to say a word," Nina murmured as Sabrina dropped her things and collapsed into her lap. "Bad news." Sabrina nodded into her friend's shoulder. "They pulled the show." "God, I'm so sorry." Her voice cracked. "I thought this was finally my turn." "It is your turn," Nina said fiercely. "Just not on their schedule." Sabrina let herself cry then. Really cry. Not just for the gallery, but for Aurelia. For the way things were unraveling, for how she kept trying to build something and watching the world tear it down every time she reached too high. That night, Sabrina stared at her blank canvas again. But this time, instead of trying to paint something perfect, she just picked up the brush and broke. She splashed color like it was blood. She tore paper, smeared pigment, used her fingers, her elbows, her anger. She didn't think, she didn't plan, she just felt. And for the first time in weeks, something inside her opened again. Meanwhile, across the city, Aurelia stood at a window she couldn't see through. Phone in hand, message half written. She typed out a dozen versions, erased everyone. She wanted to reach out, needed to. But the world around her was on fire. Her company was in chaos. The board split against her. The press relentless. She was barely sleeping, barely functioning. And yet Sabrina was always there in her thoughts, in her chest, in her blood. A quiet warmth she couldn't shake. Aurelia paced. Tried to focus. Couldn't. Finally, she tapped out a message. "I know I've been gone. I'm sorry. I don't know how to do this. And still be who I need to be, but I miss you." She hesitated, then deleted it. Instead, she typed, "Are you okay?" She hit send and waited. Sabrina saw the message after midnight. She sat on the floor of her apartment, surrounded by half-dried canvases, her hands still stained with color. She stared at the text for a long time, heart-hurting. Then with fingers that trembled more than she'd admit, she replied, "No, but I'm trying." Aurelia read the message instantly. Her chest tightened. Her throat burned. She typed, "Can I see you?" Sabrina paused, then sent, "I don't want to be a secret or a pause between board meetings. I want to matter when your world's on fire." Aurelia stared at that sentence. It felt like a wound and a truth she'd never dared face. "You do matter." Sabrina hesitated. "Then show me." The next day, Aurelia made headlines. Not for another business scandal. Not for stepping down, but for appearing unannounced at a small press event for the city's independent art scene. Dressed in black, lips painted crimson, she stood at the podium and said clearly and without hesitation, "The arts matter. They matter because they are the only language we have when the world stops making sense. We cannot afford to silence the voices who paint truth into being, especially not now." Reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. She didn't flinch. When asked why she was there, she smiled. "Because someone I care about deserves to be seen." That night, she showed up at Sabrina's door. No warning, no pretense, just a knock. Sabrina opened it, heart hammering, barefoot, and still covered in paint. Aurelia stood there holding a rolled canvas in one hand and a bottle of wine in the other. "What is that?" Sabrina asked, eyeing the canvas. Aurelia unrolled it slowly. It was blank, white, unmarked. "It's for you," she said. "Because I don't want to be the storm that ruins you. I want to be the space you paint into." Sabrina stared at her speechless. Aurelia stepped forward, voice softer now. "I was terrified. I thought I had to choose between power and vulnerability, between control and love. But I don't want to keep choosing fear. I want to choose you." Sabrina's eyes filled with tears. "Then stay and don't disappear next time it gets hard." "I won't. Promise me." Aurelia nodded. On everything I've built, you matter more. And for the first time, Sabrina believed her. Not because of the speech or the canvas or the wine, but because Aurelia was standing here in her broken little apartment without her armor. And she didn't look like a CEO. She looked like a woman who had finally decided she didn't want to be alone anymore. Sabrina pulled her inside, closed the door behind them, and kissed her like she was starting something they might actually finish this time. Aurelia stayed. She stayed through the night and didn't leave the next morning. When Sabrina woke up tangled in sheets and skin, sunlight cutting soft lines across the cracked ceiling, Aurelia was still there, hair a mess, face bare. One arm draped over Sabrina's waist like it belonged there. And maybe it did. They spent the entire day inside Sabrina's apartment. No suits, no chauffeurs, no city views or custom espresso, just coffee brewed on a stove that barely worked, 2 mugs that didn't match, and kisses between bites of toast. Aurelia sat cross-legged on the floor as Sabrina painted, silently watching her work with eyes that held something reverent. And Sabrina, despite the mess, despite the nervousness, let her watch because there was nothing left to hide. That night, curled up on the couch with a blanket over their legs and the soft hum of music in the background, Aurelia asked, "What scares you the most about all of this?" Sabrina didn't look away, losing myself in someone again. "Have you done that before?" "Once." She hesitated. "It ended with me standing in the rain, begging someone not to walk away. She did anyway." Aurelia's fingers tightened slightly around hers. "I don't want to be that person." "Then don't be." "What if I already am?" "You're not." Sabrina leaned her head on Aurelia's shoulder. "You're here. You're still here." That's already more than she ever did. Aurelia kissed the top of her head and whispered, "Then I'll keep showing up." And she did. For 2 full weeks. Aurelia Voss, untouchable CEO, headline queen. Whispered name in every boardroom. Started slipping out of her world and into Sabrina's. Quietly, steadily. She started bringing groceries to the apartment, cooking badly, but trying anyway. She learned how to stretch canvas, how to rinse brushes without wrecking the bristles. She kept Sabrina company through long painting sessions, sometimes talking, sometimes sitting in companionable silence. They made out in the hallway like teenagers, kissed against doorframes, laughed in the kitchen until flour dusted their faces. Sabrina learned that Aurelia hated coriander, that antique dolls freaked her out, and that she'd once broken her arm in college trying to impress a girl by climbing onto the library roof. Aurelia learned that Sabrina talked in her sleep, always painted barefoot, and still couldn't quite accept compliments from the people she loved. It was messy, imperfect, real, and it was good, until Aurelia's world found them again. It happened on a Friday. Sabrina was walking back from the art supply store, bag slung over one shoulder, headphones in, when she saw it, a photo, her face, her name, on a gossip blog. "Is this the woman who tamed Aurelia?" Sources say the mysterious artist has been spending nights at the CEO's apartment. Friends close to Voss say things are serious, maybe even dangerous. Her stomach dropped. She tapped the link. The photos were grainy, shot from across the street, one of her going into Aurelia's building, another through a window, blurred but unmistakable. Sabrina's lungs seized. The piece spiraled into guesses about her background, her bank account, how someone with no career and no reputation could have caught Aurelia's attention. The last paragraph burned the most. If Voss's image is already cracking under the weight of corporate scandal, an affair with a struggling nobody might be the final blow. Her phone slipped from her hand. She scrambled, called Aurelia. Voicemail. Tried again. Nothing. Her fingers shook, her chest cinched tight, the street tilting around her. And it wasn't just the article. It was the sudden truth that nothing about their world was private anymore. Not her name, not her face, not her love. By the time she reached home, Nina was there, laptop open to the same story. "I tried to get them to take it down," she said, "but it's already viral. It's everywhere." Sabrina nodded slowly, the words lagging behind her breath. Did she know this would happen? I don't think so. But she should have. She was still trembling when Aurelia finally burst in 2 hours later, breathless, heels in her hand, hair winded and wild. "I just saw it," she said. "I came as soon as I could." "They know my name," Sabrina whispered. "They know where I live. I'll handle it." "You can't handle this, Aurelia. Not like everything else. This isn't a boardroom. This is my life, my privacy, my peace." I didn't leak anything. I would never. But you didn't protect me either. Aurelia went still. I didn't think it would happen this fast. You didn't think, Sabrina snapped. You brought me into your world without preparing me for what it would do to mine. The silence that followed was merciless. Aurelia looked wrecked. Do you regret this? She asked. Us? Sabrina hesitated, then shook her head. No. But I'm scared. So am I. Then why does it feel like I'm the only one losing something? Aurelia stepped closer, voice fraying. You're not. I just don't know how to love you without breaking everything else I've built. Then maybe you need to decide what matters more, Sabrina said softly. The sentence hung there like a blade. Neither of them moved. The distance that used to pull them together felt like a canyon now. And somewhere deep in both of them, something gave way. Sabrina didn't hear from Aurelia for 5 days. No text. No call. No knock at the door. Just silence, louder than any argument. The internet didn't forget. Her name clung to the corners of blogs and forums, twisted into memes, headlines, speculation. Her social feeds turned into a battleground, strangers hurling hate, condescension, even pity. Worse than all of it were the defenders calling her brave for dating someone like Aurelia. Lucky. As if Aurelia were a prize to be claimed. As if Sabrina were only a side character in someone else's success story. She stopped painting. She stopped sleeping. The only thing she did was walk for hours through alleys, parks, abandoned neighborhoods, anywhere the world didn't know her face. And yet, even in the furthest corners of the city, her thoughts returned to Aurelia like a bruise. She couldn't stop pressing. The way she held her, the way she said her name like a secret, the way she had tried, failed, but tried. On the 6th day, Nina found her on the fire escape, knees to her chest. Hoodie pulled up despite the heat. You need to stop waiting for her to fix this, Nina said gently. I'm not, Sabrina lit. Then why haven't you picked up a brush since it happened? Sabrina didn't answer. Nina sat beside her. You love her. I do. Then you need to decide if love is enough. Sabrina turned her face away. What if it's not? Then at least you'll know you gave it everything. That night, Sabrina stood in front of a blank canvas for 3 hours. She didn't paint. She just stood there, brush in hand, heart wide open, waiting for something to come. It didn't until a knock came at the door. Soft, uncertain. She knew it was her. Somehow, even through the silence, she knew. Sabrina opened the door and there was Aurelia, drenched from the rain, soaked to the bone, hair plastered to her face, eyes bloodshot like she hadn't slept in days. Her voice cracked. I messed up. Sabrina stepped aside silently. Aurelia entered slowly, dripping water onto the floor, her hands clenched tightly at her sides like if she let go, she'd shatter. I thought if I stayed away long enough, I'd figure out how to make it better. But all I did was prove you were right. Sabrina stayed quiet, arms crossed. I wanted to protect you, Aurelia said. But I've spent so long building a life where I didn't have to protect anyone. I thought power made me safe. That if I controlled everything, I couldn't lose anything. But I'm losing you anyway. Sabrina's voice was low. You didn't lose me. Not yet. Aurelia stepped closer, hesitant. Do I still get a chance to fight for you? Sabrina's eyes burned. Only if you stop treating me like something delicate. I'm not fragile, Aurelia. But I deserve more than silence. Aurelia nodded, trembling. I know. I know that now. I'm not proud of the way I handled this. But I love you. Sabrina flinched. You've never said that before. I've never meant anything more in my life. The words hung between them like a breath. Sabrina reached out slowly, took Aurelia's wet hand into hers. Then prove it. Aurelia looked at her. How? Don't disappear again. I won't. Be brave enough to stand beside me when the world turns its back. Always. And don't just love me in private. Aurelia's expression cracked completely. I want to love you everywhere. Loudly, shamelessly, always. And with that, Sabrina pulled her in, not with desperation, but with certainty. The kiss was slow, solid, real. Rain clung to Aurelia's skin, to her lashes, to her lips. But Sabrina didn't care. She kissed her anyway. And Aurelia kissed back like she'd been starving. That night, they lay in bed, not talking, just breathing. Hands intertwined over the sheets. The storm outside mirrored the one still inside both of them, but at least they weren't weathering it alone. In the morning, Aurelia didn't leave. She made coffee. She cleaned the floor where the rain had pulled. She stood behind Sabrina as she picked up a brush and painted for the first time in almost 2 weeks. And she didn't ask what the painting meant. She just stood there and watched. Later that afternoon, Aurelia opened her phone and typed a statement, a public one. She posted it to her official accounts. Privacy is a privilege. Love is not a scandal. I am in a relationship with a woman who inspires me, grounds me, challenges me. Her name is Sabrina Moreno, and I'm no longer interested in hiding the things that matter most. It was short, but it was enough. Enough to set fire to the media again. Enough to get calls from the board. Enough to make headlines. But when Aurelia turned off her phone and looked at Sabrina across the room, none of it mattered. I'm yours, she said. No headlines, no company, just me and you. And for the first time since the night at La Luxuria, Sabrina smiled without hesitation because maybe love wasn't clean. Maybe it didn't come quietly, but it was here and she was ready to fight for it. 2. The public statement changed everything. Not just in headlines or comment sections, but in the space between Sabrina and Aurelia. The silence that used to loom between them had been replaced with clarity commitment. Aurelia's world, once polished and impenetrable, was now cracking in the light. And instead of hiding the fractures, she was letting Sabrina see them all. It didn't fix everything, but it made them real, and real was enough, at least for now. The fallout came fast, of course. Investors questioned Aurelia's emotional state. The board issued a formal letter of concern. Anonymous sources called her reckless. Some tried to spin her statement as a distraction tactic, but Aurelia didn't flinch. She walked into the next board meeting alone with her head high and her priorities sharper than ever. She let them talk. Then when it was her turn, she stood and said, I've made this company billions. I've navigated crisis, built empires, and played your game. But I'm not apologizing for loving someone who makes me better. If you think that's a liability, vote me out. I'll be gone by morning. No one voted. No one dared. That night, she came home to Sabrina's apartment. Still the same cracked walls, the same crooked window. The same fridge that made strange noises after midnight. And collapsed onto the couch like she'd survived a war. Sabrina curled up beside her, threading their fingers together. Still, CEO? Aurelia gave a tired smirk. For now, pity. I was hoping we could run away and start a commune in the woods. Maybe next scandal. They laughed, exhausted and free. But even with the world slowly shifting around them, a different storm was building beneath the surface. One neither of them saw coming. It started with a message. A simple unmarked envelope slipped under Sabrina's door one morning while Aurelia was still asleep in her bed. No name, no sender, just her name written in capital letters. Inside a photo. Grainy, black and white. Sabrina standing in front of a gallery months ago, smiling alone. On the back, a handwritten message. You don't belong in her world. You never will. That was it. No signature, no threat. But the chill it left in her spine was enough to make her drop it. Sabrina didn't tell Aurelia immediately. She hid it in a drawer, told herself it was probably someone bored, someone bitter, someone irrelevant. But it haunted her every time Aurelia kissed her forehead. Every time she woke up in the warmth of her arms, every time they talked about what came next. The second envelope came 3 days later. This time delivered directly to the gallery Sabrina sometimes volunteered at. Another photo. Her and Aurelia at the coffee shop from weeks ago. Their first real moment. Smiling close intimate. The message on the back was sharper this time. She's not safe with you. You'll be the thing that ruins her. Sabrina's hands shook as she read it. This time she didn't hide it. She went straight home, heart pounding, and waited for Aurelia to return. When she did, coat in hand, hair swept back from a long day of pretending not to be exhausted, Sabrina held the envelope out to her silently. Aurelia read it. Her face didn't change, but something inside her did. How long have these been coming? This is the second. The first 4 days ago. Why didn't you tell me? Because I didn't want you to worry. Because I thought maybe it was nothing. Aurelia shook her head. Nothing leaves handwriting like this. She pulled out her phone, called someone fast, direct security now. Full sweep, quietly. Then she turned to Sabrina. I'm sorry. I should have seen this coming. It's not your fault. It is. I brought you into this. I chose this, Aurelia. I chose you. Aurelia looked like she wanted to believe that, but the edge in her eyes said otherwise. That night, security swept the apartment. New locks were installed. Aurelia insisted Sabrina sleep at her penthouse again, just until things felt safe. Sabrina agreed, but only because she saw the panic hiding behind Aurelia's calm. The next week was quiet, no new letters, no photos, just tension. Aurelia became more protective, never letting Sabrina walk alone, having her picked up and dropped off even for short errands. Sabrina bristled at it, but didn't argue. She understood, but the fear was beginning to spread. Then the third envelope came. It was slipped into Aurelia's office, left on her desk. This time there was no photo, just one sentence typed in bold. "You can keep pretending, Aurelia, but everyone sees what this is." No threat. But that didn't matter because someone had walked past security, past cameras, past locked doors. Someone wanted to be seen. Aurelia locked the office that day. She canceled meetings. She went home early. And when Sabrina asked what scared her most, she didn't talk about the letters. She said, "What if they make you afraid of me?" Sabrina took her face in both hands. "Never. Even if I bring danger into your life, you didn't bring it. You just refused to hide from it. What if loving me hurts you? Then we bleed together." Aurelia kissed her like she was holding on to the only thing left keeping her from breaking, and Sabrina kissed her back like she was willing to be broken if it meant staying. That night, Aurelia made a decision. She didn't tell Sabrina what it was, but she stood at the window long after Sabrina had fallen asleep, phone in hand, voice low and sharp. "Find them," she said. "I don't care what it takes. I want a name." Pause. "And if they ever come near her again, I swear to God, I will end them myself." Outside, the city moved like it always did. Indifferent, busy, alive. But inside that penthouse, two women slept in the same bed, holding on to each other like war was coming, and they were ready to fight side by side. The name came 2 days later. Aurelia received the file in a sealed envelope hand-delivered by her most trusted security advisor. Inside were surveillance photos, background reports, old messages cross-referenced with new ones. It all led back to one name, Sloane Mercer. The ex-girlfriend of a former board member, a woman Aurelia hadn't seen in almost 4 years. Someone she'd forgotten, but someone who hadn't forgotten her. Sloane had once been part of Aurelia's circle briefly, seductively, manipulatively. She had loved power. She had whispered in the right ears, smiled in the right rooms, and when Aurelia cut her out when she refused to play Sloane's games anymore, Sloane vanished. Or so she thought. Now she was back, and she wasn't after money or control. She wanted humiliation. For Aurelia to crumble in the eyes of the world, and she had chosen Sabrina as her weapon. Aurelia stared at the file, at the photos of Sloane's brownstone, of her slipping envelopes into doors herself in the dead of night, always careful, always covered. Rage built in her chest like a storm. This wasn't business. This was personal. And the one person she loved most was being used as leverage. She stood, grabbed her coat, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't send anyone else. She went herself. Sabrina was painting when Aurelia arrived at the apartment. Her hands were covered in shades of gold and crimson, her hair tied messily, a streak of yellow on her cheek. She looked peaceful. Safe. Aurelia hated what she had to do next. "I found out who's been sending letters," she said quietly. Sabrina froze. Her brush hovered mid-stroke. "Who?" "Someone from my past." "Sloane Mercer." Sabrina turned slowly. Eyes guarded. "I don't know that name." "You wouldn't. It was before everything. Before the company became what it is. She wanted access to the board, to my inner circle. She used charm, rumors, manipulation until I cut her off. She's been holding a grudge ever since. And now she's using me to get to you." "Yes. What are you going to do?" Aurelia hesitated. "I'm going to confront her with what? Evidence? Threats? With truth?" Sabrina stood, wiping her hands on a rag. "Then I'm going with you." "No." "Yes. It's not safe. It's my face in those pictures. My name in those letters. I deserve to look her in the eye." Aurelia saw the fire in Sabrina's expression and knew there was no use arguing. They went together. Sloane's brownstone was pristine. White stone, perfect steps, a red door that looked like it had been chosen just to say, "I'm not like everyone else." Sabrina's heart pounded as they approached. Aurelia knocked once, controlled. Sloane opened the door herself. She hadn't aged much, still sleek, still smug. But the moment her eyes landed on Sabrina, her expression faltered. "Oh," she said, smiling too wide. "So, it's true. You're real." "I'm very real," Sabrina said evenly. "And I'm done being your punching bag." Sloane's gaze slid to Aurelia. "Bringing her here, that's brave or foolish. You don't get to speak to her." Aurelia said coldly. "Not after what you've done." "What I've done?" Sloane laughed. "I sent a few notes," Sloane said. "Nothing violent, nothing threatening. You barged into our lives. I only reminded you who you were before you went soft." Aurelia stepped forward. "I'm not soft. I'm in love. There's a difference." Sloane's smile faded. "You used to be smarter than this." "I used to be alone," Aurelia said. "Now I'm not. And you can't stand it." Sloane folded her arms. "What do you want, an apology?" "I want you to stay the hell away from us. And I want you to understand that if I see your shadow near Sabrina again, I'll see to it your name vanishes from every room that ever mattered to you." Sloane's eyes narrowed. "Is that a threat?" "No," Aurelia said. "It's a promise." The air went heavy. Sabrina held her ground, facing the woman who had tried to dismantle her from the dark. Sloane cut her one last glance. "She won't survive you. She'll learn." "No," Sabrina snapped, voice sharp. "You did. And you hated it." Aurelia found her hand, and together they turned away, back outside, into the wind, into a world still uncertain what to do with two women who refused to break. They didn't celebrate that night. No victory toast, no champagne, just quiet. The quiet of aftermath, of choices made, of battles faced and lived through. In bed, Aurelia lay with her arm draped over Sabrina's stomach, cheek pressed to her skin. "She was right about one thing," she whispered. Sabrina tensed. "What?" "I'm not the woman I was before you." "Is that bad?" Aurelia looked up, voice softer. "It's the only thing I've ever been grateful to lose." Sabrina kissed her, slow, tender, not to fix or claim, only to feel. They fell asleep with the windows open. No alarms, no panic. For the first time in weeks, Sabrina dreamed in color, and Aurelia didn't wake with clenched fists. The storm had passed, though the sky still held the weight of what they'd endured, and they knew that weight, finally, was love. The gallery was small, yet the room felt impossibly wide on the night of the exhibit. Sabrina stood alone at the center, surrounded by work born of grief, love, rage, surrender. The canvas Aurelia had once handed her blank now hung framed on the center wall, strokes of gold and black, deep crimson layered into quiet texture. It had no title, but anyone who looked at it felt something immediate, like falling, like fire, like being seen. The event was packed. Critics, artists, reporters, strangers who'd seen her name online and came out of curiosity, but stayed in awe. Her palms were sweaty. Her heart wouldn't stop racing. But she didn't shake. Not tonight. Not anymore. Aurelia hadn't arrived yet. Sabrina had looked for her the moment she stepped into the space, scanning every corner, every silhouette. But she wasn't there. Still, something in her heart told her she would come, that she had to come. The night wore on. People clapped. Speeches were made. Sabrina said a few words at the mic, brief, grateful, deeply personal. She thanked Nina, who stood near the back with tearful pride. She thanked the gallery. And then, without naming her, she thanked someone who reminded me that being seen is not the same as being consumed. People applauded, but Sabrina wasn't listening to them. Her eyes were still on the door, waiting, hoping, dreading. And then, just when she was starting to think maybe she'd been wrong, Aurelia walked in, wearing no black, no armor, no sleek CEO mask. She wore cream and silver, soft fabrics, no heels, and no entourage. Her hair was curled at the ends. Her eyes searched the room until they found Sabrina's. And in them, Sabrina saw it. The apology, the awe, the fear, the love. Aurelia crossed the room slowly, not caring who stared. She stood in front of Sabrina with her hands in her coat pockets like a woman trying to stand still while everything inside her shook. "You made it," Sabrina whispered. "I told you I would. I wasn't sure. I was." Aurelia pulled something from her coat. Not a letter. Not a gift. A small weathered photograph. Sabrina frowned. "What is that?" Aurelia handed it over. It was from the night of their blind date. That moment, the first time their eyes met across the restaurant. Someone had snapped it without them noticing. Security caught it by accident. I've had it ever since. Why did you bring it tonight? Aurelia's voice softened. Because I realized something. You looked lonely, but you didn't look broken. You looked brave. And I didn't know then that you'd change everything for me. But I look at that picture now and I see the moment my life started. Sabrina couldn't speak, her throat closed. I love you, Aurelia continued, voice raw. And I want to stop running from that. I want to stop hiding it. I want to stop fighting against the only thing that's ever made me feel whole. You're not hiding it, Sabrina whispered. Not anymore. I want more than just not hiding, Aurelia said. I want building. I want messy mornings and gallery nights and arguments about coffee brands and weekends that aren't scheduled in Outlook. I want to love you in every version of life, even the hard ones, especially those. Sabrina looked at the photograph again, then back at Aurelia. I'm scared. So am I. But you're still here. And I'm not going anywhere. Slowly, carefully, Sabrina reached into her bag and pulled something out. A tiny paint-stained envelope. I was going to wait. Maybe next week. Maybe next month. But I think this moment is ours. She handed it to Aurelia. Aurelia opened it with trembling fingers. Inside a single slip of paper. Do you want to share the rest of this life with me? Aurelia's eyes filled with tears. Is this? It's not a ring, Sabrina said quickly. Not yet. Just a question. One I couldn't ask until I was sure we'd survived. Aurelia looked at her completely undone. Yes, she whispered. God, yes. The crowd clapped. Someone had overheard. Then others joined, but neither of them cared. They didn't look away from each other. Not once. Later that night, after the exhibit closed, after goodbyes were exchanged and lights were dimmed, they walked home through the city hand in hand. No car, no driver, just the sidewalk and the wind and the sound of their laughter. Aurelia took off her shoes halfway, walking barefoot with Sabrina's heels in her other hand. This is ridiculous, she muttered. You're ridiculous. You love it. I do. When they reached the apartment, Sabrina opened the door. Aurelia walked in first, then paused. This place, it's still so small. I like it small. Why? Because it makes it easier to feel when someone's missing. Aurelia turned around slowly. I'm not going to be missing again. Then come in and stay. She did. And she stayed. Through hard days and brilliant ones, through quiet mornings and chaotic nights, through board meetings, new exhibits, loss and laughter, through everything. Sabrina never had to ask again because Aurelia answered her every day with hands, with words, with presence. And Sabrina answered back, not by changing who she was, but by choosing love even when it scared her. 2 women, 1 city, a love that started with a blind date and $20. A CEO and an artist, power and passion, fire and grounding. And finally a future neither of them had been brave enough to dream until they found it in each other. If you enjoyed this content and want to support the channel in a special way, click the thanks button below, the one with the heart and $sign icon. With super thanks, you can make a direct contribution to the channel, which helps me keep creating awesome videos for you.